I have two videos planned after this one, and those are dyspraxia in the workplace and dyspraxia and its relation to cannabis usage. And in order to talk about those topics, I can't really talk about them without talking more about anxiety first, because anxiety and panic attacks are a big part of dyspraxia in general. And when factored into the workplace and with use in cannabis, kind of becomes a little bit more prominent. And because of that, I will be talking about anxiety in this video. For those of you with chronic anxiety or very heavily intense panic attacks, this video is not medical advice by any stretch. If you do think you have generalized anxiety disorder or you're prone to chronic panic attacks, I'm not a medical professional. I would heavily suggest seeking someone who is more knowledgeable on that topic and can actually provide you with some help. While I will be giving some tips on how I've managed anxiety over the years, it's not an end-all solution, and anxiety affects everybody differently. So just be smart. Don't take this YouTube video as the law or as the end-all solution to anxiety, because it's not. Even with the ways I've been coping with it personally, I still deal with anxiety and the occasional panic attack like once in a while. So just that quick disclaimer needs to be out of the way. And without any further ado, let us get on with the video. For the sake of not making this video about 10 hours long, I will not be discussing all the different types of anxiety, nor will I be discussing anxiety disorders specifically. I do plan on making a couple videos in the future talking about anxiety specifically, and if you're interested, definitely watch, subscribe, and let me know that you're into that. But for the most part, what I'm planning on talking about is dyspraxia and its relation to anxieties, and as such, I will be referencing the different types of anxiety. So for further reading, I will leave an anxiety support page, which I did link in the beginning of this video, just so you can get a general idea of what it's like to go through anxiety and so on, and all the different types that I will be referencing in the video. Now, anxiety is also something that affects everybody basically on Earth. At some point, you have felt anxiety. Anxiety is a very common thing, although to the extent of how some people feel it, like someone with a anxiety disorder, as well as someone with, say, dyspraxia or someone on the autism spectrum, most people won't feel anxiety as intensely or as often as someone with dyspraxia or, say, autism. Now, a big reason why anxiety tends to affect people with dyspraxia is because a large amount of people with dyspraxia also happen to be diagnosed with other diseases on the autism spectrum. And so, these disorders do tend to cause a large amount of anxiety in some people. And while it's not the disorders themselves that specifically cause the anxiety, it's a lot of environmental factors added on top of the autistic spectrum disorder or dyspraxia that do cause anxiety. For instance, people who are on the autism spectrum or people with dyspraxia do have trouble performing basic tasks. And when people are presumed to be watching them, or people are watching them perform these tasks, it's very easy to create anxiety. It's my day off. Now, you may be wondering why I keep mentioning autism spectrum disorder in these videos, and that's because about 50% of people with dyspraxia are also diagnosed with ADHD, and it's only about 3 to 6% of people diagnosed with dyspraxia that don't have any other underlying conditions. And as such, dyspraxia and autism spectrum disorder tend to go hand in hand. Now, I personally do not have any sort of autism spectrum disorder, but being someone with dyspraxia and someone who has had trouble communicating
early in life, I can relate to people who are on the spectrum as well. But unfortunately, unless you have a neurological disorder or a mental disorder, it's very hard to relate to someone else who, say, has dyspraxia or autism spectrum disorder. And so that lack of communication can cause a minor social isolation. And that social isolation, that is a hard word to say. Social isolation. Social isolation. Social isolation. That social isolation can cause a lot of anxiety just in the inability to communicate what you're trying to say to somebody. And so if they can't understand you, especially with something like vocal dyspraxia, it may become harder to get your point across and thus build tension, which creates anxiety. Another thing is also the fear that people are constantly watching you, which can create more anxiety as well. And due to the inability to perform very basic tasks that dyspraxia can hinder, it makes it very, very hard to perform any sort of task in front of people. And the feeling that people are constantly watching and judging you, especially with the lack of communication, the inability to do said tasks, can create an anxiety all on its own. Now, I personally have never had social anxiety per se, but I've always had problems with the people watching me when I'm performing a task. A lot of the things that I do, I have to do differently than most people do, simply because my hands don't work the same way others do, having dyspraxia and all. For instance, when it comes to tying my shoes, I actually never learned how to properly tie my shoes, even until the age of 10. I found a half-assed way of doing it, and I'm pretty sure I'm doing it mostly right. But from the way my mom and doctors and other people look at me when I tie my shoes, it's safe to say it's probably not the most common way or the proper way to be tying your shoes. And with many things, including driving and other things, you're always going to have eyes on you to some extent. And while you can somewhat mitigate that or try to pull yourself aside or do these things while you're in the bathroom, you are eventually going to come across a scenario where you can't avoid being watched while you're doing something. Now, I don't know how true it is for most people with dyspraxia, but for me at least, of course, due to the short-term memory inhibition, it seems that when I go and talk to somebody or have a conversation with somebody, I tend to go on for a while, hence why my videos are so long. And so what'll happen is I'll start out talking about one topic and then totally forget about what I was talking about as I transition into another topic related to that topic. And so I find myself talking a lot, and I mean a lot. And when you hear people complain about other people who talk too much, it tends to give you a minor anxiety when you're talking to others who tend to complain about that sort of thing. Because you're starting to wonder if, oh, hey, am I one of those people? I tend to talk a lot. Now, I did say at the beginning of this video I would talk about how I've managed anxiety throughout all these years. And as terrible an idea as this is, and like I said, this is not medical advice. Do not take this as medical advice. This is probably a terrible idea, but for the most part, the best thing you can do is just ride it out. It's the same with anxiety from cannabis use. Hint, hint, hint. But when you're in a state of anxiety, you're not actually being threatened. If you are being threatened physically, then that's not anxiety, that's legitimate fear, and you probably should be worried. But anxiety itself is simply just a fear of something that isn't a real threat to your well-being. Something like being chased by a lion is not the same as something like being afraid that someone's going to talk shit behind your back next week. Another important thing to remember is that if someone is that much of a strain on you, that they give you constant anxiety due to their shit talking or due to them being just in general a person who you cannot trust, they probably aren't someone you should be having around you to begin with. And if you do feel threatened or you do feel like someone is creating some sort of mental or social harm to you, bring it up to someone who you can trust and who will deal with the situation. But for the most part, a little shit talking is something that we all do. I'm sure even you have had people who you have shit talked. And it is with that that I bring up something that a therapist of mine once said, and that is that we see the flaws in others that we see in ourselves. A lot of people who generally tend to talk shit or feel guilty about something that they do will start to pick up certain cues in others that are similar to their own, and thus they like to make assumptions that, oh, because this person says this thing or does this thing that I do, then they must do this other thing that I do. And the thing about the brain, the crazy thing about the brain is that it likes to make connections. And so we assume that just because X, then Y. But people don't work that way. We're dynamic and we're complex. And so it's important to remember that that person that you think is staring at you and judging you probably doesn't even recognize that you're there, or if they do recognize you're there, are probably more worried about their own problems or whatever's on their mind more than you. And again, I can't stress this enough. This isn't medical advice. This is just advice that I've been given myself that has helped me. It may not help everyone. It may help some people. It may not help anyone. But a lot of people have been saying that my videos, at least seeing how I deal with and go through things, have helped them. So hopefully this helps you guys out. And I am going to make a poll after this video is uploaded asking what you guys want to see in my next video. So watch out for that. And have a good one.